Well, Josh did his research. So thanks very much, Josh, for that introduction. I want to start by thanking Dean Rutherford and Nikolai and the Clinton School for the hospitality and the invitation. It's great to be here talking to you all, and it's great to be back in Little Rock. I was saying to Nikolai yesterday evening that this is just my second time here in town, and then my first visit was September 2015 for one of Secretary Clinton's campaign events, and that turned out to be the day that no one read my story because Scott Walker, who some of you might remember, dropped out of the race that day. So no one cared what I had to say, but remembering that got me thinking about how different our politics are today than what we expected back 16 months ago when I was last here, but also just a few weeks ago. So, a bit of background. I started covering the 2016 election cycle more or less in early 2013 when it became clear that after leaving the State Department, Secretary Clinton was going to look pretty seriously at running for president. So I followed her around the country through her book tour, and I covered the early days of candidate launches. This was back when the most interesting thing that was going to happen in the 2016 election cycle was that Mitt Romney would decide not to run because the juggernaut of Jeb Bush was going to stop him from running. So times have changed. So I covered the craziness of the primaries and eventually the strangest general election that any of us has ever seen. But now the way that I think about it is I'm tasked with covering not only a new Washington, but a political world that's starting to question everything that it thought that it knew about itself. So what I thought that I would do today is share with you all 5 big picture lessons about today's politics that I've drawn from just the first 2 months of President-elect Donald Trump's transition. I think of these lessons as the beginnings of a framework for beginning to understand the new landscape and the new politics, or at least for trying to begin to understand what's going on in a world where, as most of us in DC have been saying these days, no one knows anything, especially people who are supposed to be the experts. So, lesson number 1. The Democratic identity crisis is deeper and darker than anyone expected it to be. So one of the projects that I was working on over the final days of the 2016 campaign was working out how exactly President-elect Hillary Clinton was going to plan to structure the National Democratic Party underneath her. So I figured some things out. She was going to make a point of using her White House to empower Democratic senators and governors. I knew that much. She was planning to use her Democratic National Committee, the DNC, to work on rebuilding local parties and to start reinvesting in a lot of the on-the-ground Democratic infrastructure that sort of got rusted out in some of the rough patches of the last 8 years. Now, needless to say, that particular project now looks like it was a bit of a waste of time. But here's where we are now. The Democratic Party has minorities in the House and the Senate, the lowest number of governor's mansions that they've had in ages, just 18 of them, and only 6 states with full Democratic control of the governorship and both branches of their state legislatures. That's California, and then 5 states that aren't really known as political powerhouses. You've got Oregon, Hawaii, Delaware, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. But most importantly, the Democratic Party has no national leader. And that reality was underscored today with the lack of response to President-elect Trump's press conference, but also as President Obama sort of bid the country farewell last night with his speech in Chicago. Now, again, needless to say, this is hardly where Democrats expected to be at this point, and the unexpectedly empty landscape has led to, across the country from coast to coast, an all-out finger-pointing blitz, a frenzy to start to define the future of the Democratic Party. It's the kind of war that a lot of Republicans were expecting to have at this point in the election cycle. So there are a few factions to consider. There's the Bernie Sanders faction, which itself is divided between those who are trying to quietly, slowly pull the party to the left, and one of their big ways of doing that is trying to elect Keith Ellison, a congressman, a favorite son of the party, to be the next DNC chairman. And then there are those who are even angrier. They're insisting in a phrase that we're hearing all the time now in DC, Bernie would have won. And then on the other hand, there's the so-called Democratic establishment, which itself is divided between those who are trying to pick up the pieces by quietly, trying to come up with what went wrong with the Hillary Clinton campaign, what were the major mistakes. And there are those insisting that she would have won if not for the distrust that was stirred up during the primary by Sanders and his backers during the 6 months when things got increasingly rough. So there's the Bernie versus Hillary tension. There's Obama versus everyone else tension. There are folks who believe that the party needs to do a better job of starting to reach out to working class white men in states like Michigan, which Hillary Clinton lost. And there are those who think that the path forward is instead doubling down on President Obama's coalition that worked twice for him of younger voters and minority voters. So it's not quite the relatively straightforward Tea Party versus establishment fight that Republicans had in 2010, but it's threatening to be just as defining for the next generation of Democrats, since, as we are watching it play out in real time, there are a series of important races where this has happened. It's not only just in state Democratic parties, the most local of races where they're trying to elect new chairs now, but as the national party tries to find its new leader, trying to consider Keith Ellison or Tom Perez or a number of other national leaders who are not necessarily household names, but who are closely identified with these wings of the party. And there are gubernatorial primaries playing out in New Jersey and Virginia right now in the Democratic Party, and politicians are considering how to start running for the 2018 midterms. So these are a set of questions that Democrats are trying to figure out right now. And the result is a party that's eager and sometimes even desperate to take on Donald Trump, but it's a party that has no plan to do so in Washington or even any agreement on who would begin to come up with that central plan. So instead, what comes next is some serious soul-searching. But it turns out that Democrats in D.C. aren't the only ones going through a round of soul-searching. They're just the ones that were being particularly loud about it. So lesson number 2, Democrats' identity crisis is serious, but Republicans' identity crisis might be serious too. So they may not want to admit it, the Republicans in Washington, because they're fully in control. They've got the White House and both sides of Congress, and they've got 31 governor's seats. That's a lot. But Republicans are, whether they want to admit it or not, far, far, far away from where they expected to be right about now, too. Even some of President-elect Trump's top advisors have been quite open about saying that they didn't expect to win. So at this point, not too long ago, party operatives were eager to have this fight. The battle was going to be among the Marco Rubios, Ted Cruz's, Jeb Bush's, the Tom Cottons, the Paul Ryans, and maybe the Donald Trumps of the world of the party, and they were going to be talking about a huge swath of issues. They were going to discuss the United States' role in international affairs. They were going to discuss the party's role in immigration reform, and it was going to be a healthy battle if you believe some of the strategists who were starting to get quite worried about the party's primaries and the direction that they were starting to go. Not only presidential primaries, but primaries all the way down to the state level. Clearly, however, that hasn't happened. And what's happening instead is a much quieter war that could actually stand to make life pretty complicated for the president-elect. And that's because the Rubios and the Cottons and the Cruzes of the world have not changed their core principles. Even though they eventually fell in line behind Trump during the campaign, pieces of their long-held opposition to parts of his agenda have already started to poke through in D.C. For Rubio, for example, we just need to look at this morning. He's been sounding a note of skepticism about Rex Tillerson, who is the Exxon executive with close Russia ties who President-elect Trump has nominated to be the next Secretary of State. This morning, at the confirmation hearing in the Senate, Rubio and Tillerson had a bit of a fight. They sparred a bit about Vladimir Putin and his role in the world. For Rand Paul, on the other hand, it's been breaking with Paul Ryan and members of his own party and the party leadership and insisting that Republicans should not force a vote on repealing Obamacare until they have a full plan ready to go to replace it. So he's been a voice of dissent. In other words, the GOP's broad coalition of libertarians, neoconservatives, movement conservatives, Tea Partiers, Trumpers, and whatever other buzzwords you want to use is still as broad as ever, but it's also as fragile as ever. So now we have party leaders, even their party leaders, are beginning to acknowledge that the all is well feeling that they've been trying to run through their press releases and speeches ever since we had the election, that feeling may not last forever, let alone the full 4 years of President-elect Trump's first term. So what they're saying, in short, behind closed doors, is once the administration starts trying to force its legislative priorities, we should expect to see some of the deeper fault lines a bit more clearly. In the meantime, however, the Trump team is focused on getting its cabinet filled, as we've seen today, and that process has illuminated lesson number 3. Republicans may not yet have a comprehensive strategy for pushing their full agenda in Washington, but step 1 is set, and that's to completely overwhelm the Democrats. We just need to use the example of Steve Bannon. So one of the first things Democrats decided to be outraged by after the election, which of course, the result that they didn't expect at all was that Trump intended to give Steve Bannon, a Breitbart News executive and a very controversial guy, a top role at the White House. So for weeks, for days, there were protests, rallies, petitions from Democrats across D.C. It wasn't just rank-and-file voters, it was members of the party leadership. They were saying under no circumstances was Steve Bannon going to get a job in the White House. They would not stand for it. All you could hear about in Washington was Steve Bannon. And then new Trump appointments started rolling in. One more unacceptable in congressional Democrats' eyes than the last. There was Michigan billionaire Betsy DeVos for Education Secretary, Ben Carson for Housing and Urban Development, Andrew Puzder, a Hardee's executive for the Labor Department, Jeff Sessions, the Alabama Senator for Attorney General. The list really does go on. But Democrats, unable to effectively coordinate a plan in their current state of disarray and with no way to stop the nominations with not enough votes in the Senate, they were left effectively powerless. All they could do was put out furious press releases and unleash a bunch of angry speeches. And that powerlessness wasn't surprising to them, but what was surprising was Republicans' embrace of a sort of blunt force tactic, which is to just flood the opposition. And that, they think, is now a sign of things to come. And so today, conveniently enough, offers a prime example of that new reality. Today, Wednesday, January 11th, was always going to be Exhibit A in Republicans' interest in Republicans in Washington, interest in continuing to hit Democrats with so much information at once that they wouldn't know which piece to latch onto. The president-elect, for one, was due to hold his first press conference since July. Back then, that was the press conference when he seemingly invited Russians to hack Secretary Clinton's email, or said, maybe someone should look into that. And then he had the press conference this morning. But among the issues he had promised to address today were the potential conflicts of interest involving his business and the presidency, reports of Russian hacking and its influence on the election, his nominees, the role of his family, his legislative priorities, and what's going to happen with Obamacare. And all of that was before last night's allegations about his relationship with Russia, information that is unverified and that he's vociferously denied, but that he had hardly fully engaged with. But all that was just the beginning, because eyeing an opportunity to flood the zone, Republicans had originally scheduled 9 nominee hearings for today. That would essentially ensure that any single piece of Democratic maneuvering for attention, as Democrats are trying to figure out how to get attention, or any rough moments for some of his more controversial picks, like some of the showdowns that Rex Tillerson had today on the subject of Russia, would be drowned out by the action in Trump Tower. So by the time the evening's cable news segments are written, we're likely going to be hearing about Trump's press conference, not about Tillerson's clashes with senators like Rubio. And how do we know that the full court press strategy is working and that the Trump team is perfectly eager to keep it going? Steve Bannon, for one, has been completely forgotten about. Democrats don't talk about him anymore. But lesson number 4, however, does involve a bit of digging into today's hearings, even if they're going to be otherwise ignored. And that's because something completely unprecedented is happening. And the very fact that something completely unprecedented is happening seems to be happening every single day now. In other words, lesson 4 is that the characters may be largely the same, but the old norms of Washington are gone. Precedent is being broken across the city on customs big and small, and you can say this is a good thing. And I don't just mean it's on things like the president-elect's choice to replace the man who has served as the public announcer for every inauguration since Eisenhower. That really happened. But instead, look at the confirmation hearings for Jeff Sessions, because he's likely to become the next Attorney General. And what's happening today, right around now actually, is that Cory Booker, the Democratic senator from New Jersey, is personally testifying against Jeff Sessions. And this is the first time in Senate history that one sitting member of the Senate is challenging another in this direct a manner. The stakes, Booker says, and other Democrats agree with him, are high enough that the traditions of the usually staid and not particularly fireworks-filled Senate, they need to be abandoned. We should forget about traditions and decorum. And that sentiment that it's time for a change, that this matters too much for the old ways of doing business, is now coming from both sides. It's coming from the incoming White House, which over the last few weeks tried to push to confirm a handful of its nominees, including some billionaires like DeVos or Wilbur Ross, into Senate confirmation hearings this week before they'd filled out their mandatory ethics paperworks, which are designed to guard against financial conflicts of interest. But on a much less formal level, it's also coming from members of Congress themselves. They're trying to respond to the new White House, after all, because what less than our new president could force those elected officials to start a new daily routine where they have to look at Twitter first thing in the morning and right before they go to bed at night. In the new Washington, lawmakers, both Republicans and Democrats are talking about this openly, are now actively training themselves for a potential era of legislation via tweet storm. And that's because the rules that guided conduct in old DC are quickly being discarded as irrelevant. But maybe the subjects of lesson number 5 have been thinking, maybe it's DC that's going to be irrelevant. So party professionals on both sides who are planning for the next few years are, after all, waking up to a new reality. And this is lesson number 5, that the most consequential political fights over the next few months and years are about to go very, very local. So there's no doubt that the capital, D.C., will be the site of the biggest policy battles coming down the pipeline, whether it's Obamacare, immigration reform, some international affairs questions that are surely going to be coming soon. And it's tempting to think that ongoing contests like the race for the next DNC chairmanship, which is currently raging in D.C., for example, are going to be the defining contests. But I don't think that's necessarily going to be the case. All we need to do is follow the money. Republicans have been very organized here in investing heavily in local races down to the town level for years, winning enough, for example, state legislature and governor seats ahead of the 2010 election cycle to gain majorities or total control of states where they could influence the process that happens every 10 years of redistricting, the process used to draw and redraw the congressional maps. Now, recognizing how Republicans were able to tilt maps in their favor 7 years ago, Democrats have now begun pouring cash into their own attempts to win back those local state level seats ahead of 2020's redistricting round. And that effort is being led by none other than Barack Obama and his former Attorney General Eric Holder. So this is happening at the highest levels of the party. And it's not just state legislative races that are about to get way more national attention, as we learned in just the last few weeks. Races for even state party chairmanships have suddenly become a top priority on both sides of the aisle. And these are not races that people tend to pay attention to on a national level. For Democrats, these usually sleepy races to run state party committees in states so far including Nebraska, Wisconsin, Wyoming, Iowa, Hawaii, Washington, Maine, they've already turned into these fiery proxy wars for the future of the party between Bernie Sanders loyalists and Clinton supporters. And this is boiling up in other states across the country. And for Republicans, the stakes might actually be even higher. Trump himself set the tone for years of local wars by personally making calls last week in the middle of his transition for his preferred candidate in the race no bigger than the Ohio Republican Party chair. So these are not the kinds of races that presidents are usually concerned with, but that's not stopping Obama and it's not stopping Trump. And tradition isn't stopping state attorneys general, which is another local role that's often extremely important within states, but not necessarily with the same level of national resonance, from suddenly becoming some of the most politically engaged and potentially important people in the country either. It's the latest step in a long-running trend. Just take, for example, on the Democratic side, New York Attorney General Eric Schneiderman, whose office has said it's ready to sue the Trump administration the second it senses a relaxation of environmental, labor, or financial regulations. Or take Javier Becerra. Now, he was a longtime congressman in Washington, a leader of the Democrats in Congress, but he just returned to California, and he's now in Sacramento, where he's about to be confirmed, likely, as that state's version of a wartime attorney general. His job, according to his new boss, Governor Jerry Brown, is to basically throw lawsuits at the White House at every turn. He's modeling his strategy after a hyper-aggressive example that was set by none other than Texas, a rather anti-Obama state. The entire role, in the words of Texas's former Attorney General, who's now its governor, Greg Abbott, was, I go to the office, I sue the federal government, and I go home. In other words, welcome to a new world. It's one in which presidents of the United States are digging into state house campaigns and where California is the new Texas. So there you have it. Democrats are, as the saying goes, in disarray, but so might be Republicans. And they may not have a fully fledged strategy for pushing their agenda yet, but they know that they're going to try and overwhelm the Democrats at every turn. And that's no surprise, because DC's usual rules of engagement have been tossed out the window. And maybe, finally, understanding all of that about Washington only gets us so far, since the real action moving forward is going to be out here in the States. And those 5 lessons, I hope, can set us on a path to understanding the next 4 years, or at least beginning to try to understand the next 4 years, because it promises to be a stretch in which the conventional wisdom will keep wilting, pundits will keep making fools of themselves, and D.C. will probably keep getting turned on its head. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Gabe. All right, everybody, you got your shot. Raise your hands. Good questions here. Come on. Yes, ma'am. Here comes the microphone right at you.
You probably won't be able to answer this for me, but we had 3 people that were elected as Democrats here in the state of Arkansas convert over to Republicans in the last few weeks. Now, if I vote for somebody running as a Democrat, I don't expect him to be a Republican later. What, if anything, is there available to stop that kind of defection? I mean, we used to be a blue state. We are anything but a blue state now.
Yeah, I don't know if there's anything to stop that kind of defection, is the real answer.
They can just switch anytime they want.
Yes, they can.
So legally speaking, they can do that. Obviously, the answer, I suppose, is just to promise to hold them accountable next time they come up for election. But this is one of the things that President Obama and Attorney General Holder are actually trying to work on the state and local level. What they're trying to do is elect a raft of left-leaning or Democratic local officials who are really going to have new power, so that folks who are elected to local races like that don't feel the incentive to try and switch over just to go along. Because what they're trying to do is basically have a takeover. Arkansas is a great example of a state that has switched in recent years. You know, it's certainly turned further red, if not switched entirely, obviously. And what they're trying to do is start to peel that back. So they're choosing their spots, but what they're trying to do is slowly but surely, by playing in these individual state legislature races, which are hyper-local races, they're going to try and turn these state legislatures blue again.
Other questions? Yes, here's a question right here. Governor Tucker first, and then you can pass the microphone down.
Given the behavior in the last election, what can we expect in the way of political party or candidate media use, and what type of media, and what's most likely to be effective, do you think?
That's a great question. I'm afraid that no one has a good answer for that one yet, because by all accounts, the candidates just tweeting whenever they want to seems to work. And going around reporters whenever they want to seems to work. So it's something that reporters are trying to deal with right now. But I've been talking with a lot of up-and-coming folks who are trying to maybe look at running for president 4 years down the road, or run for state office. And their answer is they're trying to break down as many of the traditional barriers as possible, seeing what this last election showed us. So you could expect candidates to run their own Twitter feeds. You can expect them to try and sit for a lot more personal interviews and not try and have as many blocks between them and the press. But the answer is, this is a long-time trend, that you're likely not going to see a lot of cooperation between national level politicians and the traditional media guardians. I'm getting less and less interviews with national politicians, because they say they can just get their message out to the public, in unfettered ways, either on Twitter or on YouTube or however. So their incentives for talking to someone like me are lower and lower. Now, I try to make myself someone that they want to talk to, and many people in my business do the same. But this is an issue that a lot of folks in Washington are trying to deal with right now, and there's a lot of consternation among reporters in particular that the lessons of the 2016 election are that we're not needed anymore.
JP.
Following the election, what do you see the Clinton family's role in American politics as?
Yeah, anyone here have any ideas? I mean, it's a great question, and it's one that I think they are trying to figure out. Obviously, the role of a former president, a former secretary of state, is to be, they will be there to answer questions for up-and-coming party leaders. All indications is that President Clinton will continue to work with the Clinton Foundation. But that is a question that a lot of Democrats are asking themselves right now. Right now, if you look at the DNC chairman's race, for example, folks aren't talking about Secretary Clinton or President Clinton. They'll mention Bernie Sanders, they'll mention President Obama, but for at least a cooling off period, it seems like Secretary Clinton's name is not being mentioned that much. My guess is that in a few years, depending on what the national landscape looks like, depending on how popular President Trump turns out to be, you might start to see them reemerge on the campaign trail. You might start to see them campaigning for candidates in states where it makes sense, certainly raising money for candidates because they remain quite popular within the party. But I don't think that either of them is under any illusions that they are the futures of the party. So I don't think we're going to see Secretary Clinton run for president again, for example.
More questions? Yes, sir, right back here.
If history is any lesson to any of this, if you go back to the '64 presidential election between Lyndon Johnson and Barry Goldwater, the Democrats were in full control of the government, both at the Supreme Court and Congress. There were very, very few Republican congressmen. If history is any lesson, do you think there is a problem that the Republicans are going to have to deal with in the coming years regarding history?
You mean in terms of how parties will have a hard time managing things if they're totally in control?
To maintain control of the three branches of government, as the Democrats have for many years, and where it culminated into, I believe, in 1965, there were only 42 Republican congressmen. Can they face that reality depending on what goes on in the future regarding promises, regarding unemployment, employment, et cetera?
Yeah, well, clearly the question of setting high expectations is a big one in our current Washington environment, because no one has set higher goals than the president-elect, who has said he's going to be the greatest jobs president ever, things like that. Now, the question is whether his voters will hold him accountable for this, and he may well prove right on a number of these promises. But I think an important point to make is that we're in a fundamentally different situation now than we have been in previous times when there's unified control of government, because the president-elect's approval rating is quite low right now. It's less than 50%, which is something that we don't often see for an entering president. And that means that he's likely to have a higher level of resistance than we've seen for other presidents who have come in with full congressional control. But the question of whether they're going to have trouble, we'll see. A lot of it really depends on whether Democrats, both in D.C. but around the country, can organize a way of really pushing back in a convincing way. Because I think what a lot of them are trying to figure out now is what is the proper message. The 2018 election cycle looks pretty foreboding for Democrats. A lot of the Democrats who are up for re-election are in very red states. So folks are not expecting to win back a lot of Senate seats.
You mentioned the role of Democratic AGs. I'm wondering, have you given any thought to these Republican AGs that have continually for the last 8 years pushed back against the Obama administration, what role they're now going to play for the next 4 years as their knowledge over the last 8 of federal law has increased and they become more involved against pushing back against rules and regulations?
Absolutely. I think they're going to be more important than ever as well. I think they won't obviously be in the opposition role, but I think what we're going to see for Republican attorneys general is that they know the tricks in the book. They know what Democrats are going to do after having, in many cases, done it themselves for the last 8 years. So they will fight back. And I think what we've seen is that the president-elect has struck up relationships with some attorneys general in particular. And in some of those cases, he is relying on their legal advice. And I think what we're going to see is much more pitched battles in a lot of these electoral fights, because President Obama was often hesitant to weigh into these fights as they were going through the courts. We haven't necessarily seen that from President-elect Trump. What I would expect to see him do is lean more heavily on the AGs in states like this one, obviously, who've been on the front lines of these fights. Absolutely.
Yes, right here. Here's a question, Bob, right in front of you. Nathan has one right here.
I'm interested in your thoughts on the validity of the story that BuzzFeed broke yesterday, and just sort of, it's unconfirmed, but I'm interested to hear what you think on it.
I think it's a really interesting question for what. Part of it is a media question for what media outlets should be publishing if they're unconfirmed. My colleagues had heard a similar thing and looked into it, didn't find enough, so we didn't publish it. These rumors have been circulating for a long time. I'd heard something similar a while ago. And many news organizations decided not to go with it because if you can't confirm it, it's very easy to find yourself in legal trouble, and it's not necessarily their most responsible thing to do. In this particular situation, they're treading a line closely by saying, we want Americans to try and understand. And for those who don't necessarily know, though I think it's gotten pretty wide, BuzzFeed News published a dossier that had been compiled, allegedly, by a former British intelligence agent alleging ways in which the president-elect could be compromised by his ties to Russia, or had been compromised by his ties to Russia. And there were some details that I won't go into here. It's clearly a question that I think reporters are trying to deal with right now. This is a topic that people are going to dig into very, very, very closely. And the president-elect's denials this morning were not necessarily specific enough to push people off the case. So I can't speak to the validity of what was published, but the questions of his ties to Russia, he's going to deny them and continue to deny them. But there's no doubt that Democrats in particular are going to keep pushing on this, and it's a topic number one for reporters.
Yes, we got a question right here.
You mentioned a little while ago your thoughts on the confirmation hearings, and I want to focus on that.
Sure.
My question is focused on winning the battle and losing the war, or vice versa. Number one, is there a war to win by challenging this slate of potential folks? And number two, who's the most vulnerable? And I guess if I can slip in a number three, from a political standpoint, what is the long-term benefit if a potential position is successfully challenged?
Well, as many people I'm sure here have seen, in history, even when we don't have a situation now where one party really can't stop these nominations from going through purely on party line votes, some of these nominees will fail. In historically speaking, not every nominee goes through. The question will be whether these people just trip up in ethics review or something else comes up. One thing that Democrats have not done over the last few weeks is really pick and choose their battles on this front. Many people had expected them to say, here are going to be our priorities and make this explicit for which nominees they were planning to fight against. One of the problems is that Democrats have a problem with each of these nominees, as often happens in these fights, and they think that each of them is unacceptable. What I think we're likely to see as some of these confirmation hearings go on is people will try to focus a little bit more on where they see the early breaking points. Sessions had a long confirmation hearing yesterday, and Democrats didn't feel very confident afterwards because a lot of Republicans came to his side, and there weren't a lot of obvious points where they think they can bring Republicans over to their side to vote against Sessions, because Democrats don't have enough to stop him just in a party line vote. But what we saw this morning with the Tillerson hearings is that Marco Rubio, for example, was very skeptical of what he heard. So I think when you see these places where there are Republicans who seem open to breaking from their party, that's where you're going to see Democrats start to hammer down over the next few days. As to the broader philosophical question of what's the use of fighting some of these fights, I think the answer that you would find in Washington is that there are a lot of policy fights that are going to be in which these cabinet secretaries are going to be extremely important, particularly in this administration, because the president-elect has signaled that he's going to have a particularly empowered cabinet. So I think Democrats are not really necessarily willing to fight the broader philosophical fight about what's the use of stopping these folks. What they are looking at is the short-term policy implications of, for example, confirming Puzder to the Labor Department, which many of them are terrified about, or Tillerson to state. And on the issue like Russia, that's one where they're clearly interested to drill down on him.
Hi, I have a question. My name is Catherine. I'm a first-year Clinton School student. Thank you for coming. My question is, because of the disarray of the two parties, do you see an emergence of a third party possibly coming in? Thank you.
It's certainly something that people have looked to. I think realistically that's not going to happen in the next 4 years. Two of the people who have been most successful over the last 2 years, Donald Trump obviously, and Bernie Sanders to a lesser degree, come from outside of their party's mainstreams. But both of them found that the way to electoral success in the short run is to go within the cloaks of the parties. There are certainly folks who are advocating a third way forward, and who knows if Democrats continue to have real problems coming together, and if President-elect Trump is not successful in a lot of his initiatives, it is possible. But because of the way that the political money is set up, because of our first-past-the-post system in congressional races, it still seems like far-fetched at this point.
Craig's got a question right up here, right here, and right here.
I think we all understand the problems the Democrats have had at the local level. But at the presidential level, the Republicans have only won one popular vote since 2000. So, two-part question. How bad is it really? And secondly, does the closeness of these national elections suggest a possibility for more bipartisan cooperation, or at least more visibility for groups like No Labels?
In theory, yes. What I would say is we have to wait and see what happens with this administration, because the incoming Trump administration has been very, very, very eager to throw aside the notion that he lost the national vote, which of course, the popular vote, which of course he did. What they're trying to do is make the case that he is a huge mandate, and that any questions of questioning the legitimacy of how he was elected be thrown aside entirely, which is a way of saying that that is not a conversation that is happening on the national level, to the degree that, for example, some folks who worked on the Clinton campaign want it to. The question of how bad things really are for Democrats, there are a number of people out there saying, hold on, folks, things are not so bad at all. As you just said, Democrats have been winning national popular votes. That, however, is not how Democrats are elected, and a lot of how presidents are elected. And a lot of folks within the party are spending all of their time looking at the electoral maps and trying to find a way to not change too much and basically make things work out. You know, if the next Democratic presidential candidate loses Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, and I might have the math slightly wrong on this, but more or less, but wins back Florida and then wins Arizona, they're going to win. So in some ways, they're discovering new states. They're looking for new states to go into, like Arizona. They're considering ditching old states like Michigan and Wisconsin, which we all thought were deep blue. It's a big soul-searching moment, but the very question of how bad things really are is a question that a lot of people are asking themselves. The short answer is that a lot of folks in D.C. believe the reason Democrats won over the last 2 of the last 3 cycles was that Barack Obama was a different kind of candidate, and they're not going to have another one of him. So those folks are saying a lot more needs to change.
Got a question right here.
Hi, my name is Fiona Sloan, and I'm a first-year student at the Clinton School. And there seems to be a really pervasive perception that news these days can just as easily be fake as it is real. If you look at Donald Trump's Twitter feed last night, you see the one side saying it's all fake, and if you listen to Obama's speech last night, there's the one side saying we need to accept facts. How can the media in the U.S. and in your line of business gain back the trust of the American people on both sides of the aisle?
Yeah, that's the question that we all go to bed every night thinking about and wake up every morning thinking about. And there's no easy answer for it. I think the answer is we have to continue to be vigilant, continue to report critically. But I don't think there's a short-term answer to this question, as unfortunate as that sounds. I think the go-to answer for a lot of reporters has been keep doing what we're doing, but do it louder. But clearly that hasn't been working. So this is a fundamental question that political journalists all around the country are working to figure out right now. Part of it is simply not acquiescing when we're called fake news. And I think what happened today, for example, is a good example of how people can start to fight back. During the press conference that happened this morning with the president-elect, he refused to take a question from CNN and screamed CNN, and said to the screaming reporters and said, "CNN is fake news. I'm not dealing with you people," which many of his supporters would say is fine. And I'm not saying you have to call on any one person during a press conference, but what CNN then did was, right after the press conference, cut back to its studios where its anchors basically defended themselves. That doesn't necessarily look great if you are a Trump supporter trying to understand the news, but it might be in the short run the way that media organizations have to assert themselves and say, this is how we get things done, this is how we do our reporting, and if you don't like it, then.
Susan, we have a question right here. What, microphone coming at you.
If you had been at the press conference this morning and able to ask a question, what would your question have been?
I would have spent a few hours trying to come up with it. I think there are two topics that I'm particularly interested in. So I'm not going to give you a direct question because I got to think about that. But the question of the ties to Russia and his campaigns and allegations that members of the president-elect's campaigns had contacts with Russian officials during the campaign is something that I would want to get his take on, but that's difficult because he's just going to say, no, that didn't happen, and move on. But the other issue that I think is particularly important is really asking him to play out the implications of the business arrangement that he's trying to set up with his family. He says that his sons are going to run the business and that he's not going to have anything to do with it, but then he jokes, well, but if it doesn't go well, I'll fire them. Those two things are obviously, that doesn't work. So what I would try to do is try to understand exactly what the arrangement is going to look like and try to understand what the day-to-day looks like. He said earlier today at the press conference that he was offered a $2 billion deal in Dubai, but he turned it down. I mean, that sounds to a lot of Democrats who have been saying in the moment since then, well, it sounds like the president just bragged about not taking a bribe. Now, I wouldn't go that far necessarily. But what needs to happen is a very specific enumeration of what the lines are between the business and the Oval Office, and not just in general terms that I'm going to let the sons run it and not have anything to do with it, but on specific issues of when foreign governments want to invest, on what new deals are going to look like. How is he going to deal with the political implications? What is it going to look like when his business ahead of the 2020 election, if they start to build a new building in Des Moines?
Got time for one more question. Yes, sir, right here.
Neither President Clinton nor Secretary Clinton have been known for being at a loss for words. How do you explain their silence since the election?
That's a good question. I think genuinely they are still trying to figure out what went wrong, because I think they both knew that it was a possibility that she was going to lose, but having covered her, lived on that plane for a few months and known her campaign staff quite well, I don't think they've ever thought there was a 51% chance of it, maybe until the final days. So I think a lot of this is them trying to figure out what exactly went wrong. But they're both shrewd politicians, and I think a lot of what they're trying to do also now is allow Democrats a path forward that does not make it seem as if they're being overbearing in any way, while at the same time not try and finish the election cycle by looking like they're trying to diminish or delegitimize Donald Trump's presidency because they want to be responsible citizens. So I think they have made the calculation that they can't go out there and try and be as vocal as possible. And I'm sure that they want to be. You know, Secretary Clinton has spoken behind closed doors a few times, and she has said that she lost because of the involvement of FBI Director Comey and the Russians. But I think what's happening now is a broader reconsideration of what went wrong and what the party needs to do in the future. And they just know that they can't be the ones to go out and have a press conference and say that.
I know there are more questions, and I encourage you to come up and visit with Gabe because we're honored to have him at the Clinton School. 26-year-old guy covering the 2016 presidential elections.